Okay, so my paper was about BP. I wanted to do it about BP because of the 2010 Deepwater Horizon disaster, where BP was cutting some corners when it comes to their processes in order to cut costs, and ended up uh, having a lot of lives lost, which was not great. So the first portion of the analysis was the external, which through that we looked at the environmental factors that were affecting the industry, which BP runs in the oil and gas industry. And then we looked at the industry itself, and then we did a 5 forces analysis, a driving forces analysis, a predominant competition analysis, and then I gave some external recommendations on how companies in this industry should survive due to increasing regulations and changes in the industry, which we'll get more into later. And then the second half of the analysis was looking at BP itself, the organizational structure, their resources, their finances, a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats analysis, and then again, some overall recommendations and a value chain analysis. So, just a little bit about BP. BP is technically a multifaceted company. So they work not only in oil and gas, but also in energy and a couple other industries as well, but their predominant one is oil and gas. And then they have made some steps since governmental regulations have been increased to reduce their environmental footprint, and we're going to take a look at the outcomes of that. The purpose of this analysis, again, was to discover how BP has changed since the Deepwater Horizon disaster, and how they can return to their former glory before it. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about BP. They also are, in 2012, they were regarded as the world's 6th largest energy company, and that was after the Deepwater Horizon disaster as well. They run in 6 different areas of production, being refining, marketing, petrochemicals, power, and biofuels. And then as far as the Deepwater Horizon disaster goes, in 2010, there was some oil leakage into the Gulf of Mexico, which caused the drilling rig named Deepwater Horizon to explode, which ended up killing 11 workers. And ever since then, there's been many scrutinization of BP to literally clean up their act. And so as a result of that disaster, they had been pushed for the first time since 2010 to completely change their processes. They transformed themselves for the first time since 1998 when they merged with Standard Oil to become the British Petroleum we know today. They also had a new slogan implemented with the same initials as the company, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. So some of the changes they made, they sold off $75 billion worth of assets to take care of the fines, claims, and bills that came from the Deepwater Horizon disaster. They also fired 2 of the top company's executives. They gave minor employees the jurisdiction to stop operations if they thought that things were going wrong or something was unsafe. Which was not available to them before. And some of the disasters that BP has taken part in could have been taken care of if that had been implemented before. BP at the time held 17% of dividends paid to customers. And after the spill, the value of their bonds hit 0. So the economy in Britain, where they were predominantly running in, was rocked. So that's just a little bit about BP. So the next part of this analysis is the macro-environmental factors analysis. And this is not about BP. This is the oil and gas industry. So this is that first section of the analysis. And so one of the tools that's used to do an environmental analysis is the PESTEL analysis, and PESTEL stands for political, economic, social, cultural, technological, environmental, and legal. So throughout the course of this analysis, I found that political factors tended to be strong. Again, my diagram here is color-coded, so red is strong, green is weak, and yellow is moderate. So the political factors were considered strong, again, because there is low differentiation in product, which makes it difficult for companies to gain advantage. Also OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, they essentially tell what companies can export and how much, with the goal of stabilizing respective economies and oil markets. And another huge political factor actually being implemented currently is Brexit. Like said earlier, British Petroleum plays a huge role over in England, and so ever since Brexit, there's been a lot of shifts since the United Kingdom decided to leave the EU. This Brexit was supposed to be agreed upon and everything settled in March of 2019, but as of today, there's still only a few official negotiations that were made, and even then, people are still up in the air. The remaining countries in the EU are still up in the air on how this is going to affect trade in oil specifically, because the United Kingdom accounted for 72% of the oil production in the EU. So it's likely the EU will experience a dramatic decline of resources following Brexit, and therefore the industry as a whole will probably be shaken as well. The next factor in the PESTEL analysis is economic. This one I deem to be weak because there were three main factors that really drive the economic factors of this industry, and that's the economic growth of developing countries, the increasing disposable incomes of their consumers, and the increasing global trade of firms from developing countries. So first, that that economic growth of developing countries. These countries that do not already have treaties and agreements have complete control of production over oil in their markets. And if they have an abundance of resources, this can be a threat to already existing governments. Companies are, pushed to really dominate over these economies as they're still growing, and try to stay ahead of the game when it comes to those, and not fall behind when these smaller countries that may have an abundance of resources start getting into global trade. The next one, increasing disposable incomes of consumers. This is considered an opportunity to firms in the market or in the oil and gas industry, because the more money consumers have to spend in an industry, the more they can buy and the more profits the company is likely to make. For example, a person with less disposable income is more likely to take the bus, bike, or carpool to their destinations instead of spending money on gas for their personal vehicles. So people with more disposable incomes will be more likely to take their personal vehicles, therefore spending more money on gas, therefore oil and gas companies will be making more money when people have more disposable incomes. And then the last economic influence I have listed here is changes in price, foreign exchange, economic stability, economic policy by OPEC, and interest rates. Any fluctuation of these can have an impact on all the leading players in the oil and gas industry. And this can be very dangerous. Oil and gas prices are extremely volatile and are subject to change at any moment. The next section I have is sociocultural forces, or factors, excuse me. And this one I deemed moderate because every consumer has their own needs and preferences. Some consumers are going to prefer more environmentally friendly options as opposed to gas. So these consumers would be more likely to carpool or bike or walk, depending on the distance, and less likely to spend money on gas, especially if that company is known for not upholding environmental standards. And in today's day and age, it is becoming more and more aware to the younger population of the environmental impact. And so as the younger generation becomes older, it is more likely that these companies are going to hit a decline in profits as these younger generations end up pushing for more environmentally friendly options. The next force is technological, and that one, or technological factors, excuse me. Technology in the last 50 years has extremely rapidly changed, and every company that has come out with the next big thing, for example, Apple coming out essentially with the smartphone, has remained market dominant unless they just didn't keep up. Like Blockbuster was extremely market dominant at the time because they had, the next big thing, but then as soon as Netflix came out with the next big thing, Blockbuster became irrelevant because they didn't keep up with the market demand for technology. And throughout the course of the study, I found that every industry has pretty much stayed to these guidelines. If companies do not stay with that technological factor, they will become irrelevant. So that's why this force is moderate as well, because companies are extremely urged to put time and resources into research and development of new technology, because that company that finds the next big thing when it comes to renewable energy especially is going to essentially become and remain market dominant once they become market dominant, they keep up with technology, or they forerun technology. For an example of that, automation, again, will speed up processes and help drive costs down as well. The next factor in the Pastel analysis is the environmental factors. Businesses in the oil and gas industry must remain ever vigilant of the world around them and the increasing impact this market has on the environment. There are three major factors on companies in this industry related to the environment. First, as it becomes easier and easier for the public and even some innovative companies to recycle, this can lead to a cleaner environmental future. Second, as the world consumes more and more energy, companies will be looked to for sustainable measures, and companies will have more opportunities to make profits. And lastly, the fact that there is a limited amount of oil out there, and companies will either have to start looking towards renewable energy options or risk becoming irrelevant in the industry. I have some quotes from Kissinger that backs this assumption as well. Excuse me. To summarize the environmental section, oil and gas sector companies must be on the lookout for renewable resource opportunities and how to best use that opportunity to make the greatest profit. And they must be following all guidelines set by their respective countries. So For this reason, the environmental force is moderate. And then lastly, legal factors. This one was rated strong because any company that does not follow their government's regulations and legal regulations will be hit with fines and very expensive taxes that will not prove helpful to the company in the long run. So essentially that is why that one is strong. And then to summarize the Pastel analysis, again, the legal and political forces are strong. Environmental, technological, and sociocultural are moderate, and economic is weak. This leads firms in the oil and gas industry to gear their strategies heavier towards addressing and combating the political and legal factors and making sure they stay on top of them, with a lesser focus but still driven towards technology, environment, and social cultural factors, and just keeping in the back of their mind the consideration for economic factors. And this will lead companies to have an effective competitive strategy in the oil and gas industry. So for the oil and gas industry, there are three processes. There's downstream, midstream, and upstream. Excuse me. Upstream is best known as the sector that explores and procures, for example, the sector that searches for the natural gas pockets in the earth and the ocean. Midstream is the portion of the process where crude resources need to be transported, stored, and processed, including the use of tanker ships and pipelines. And then lastly, the downstream portion is considered to be the part of the process where the raw materials taken in the first phase are filtered and refined and then ready for consumers. And when referring to the oil and gas industry, that's not just gas that you put in your car. These firms also produce products such as asphalt, natural gas, and crude oil. But the main dominant one is petroleum, which is vital to other industries such as solvents, pharmaceuticals, plastics, and fertilizers. And then, because of recent environmental disasters, this has caused the oil and gas industry to be painted in a poor light and thus have pushed consumers towards renewable energy, which is the greatest threat to the industry. A more recent threat to the industry is the collapse of prices in 2014, and it left the industry slow moving forward. Excuse me. Recently, the oil and gas industry has begun to grow again, though. According to Oil and Gas IQ in 2008, an estimated 100,000 jobs were added to the market, and the price of crude oil stabilized, with the amount of drilling rigs in the U.S. increasing by almost 76%. So we saw that initial decline in 2014, but it started to come back in more recent years. Because of the decline in 2014, there have been cuts to exploration and maintenance, which has actually had a bad reaction, because if you cut funding to maintenance, then there's going to be more environmental disasters, which is not going to help the outlook for the industry. Some of the dominant economic features of the oil and gas industry is the number of rivals, scope of rivalry, buyer needs and requirements, degree of product differentiation, product innovation, technological change, vertical integration, and economies of scale. So, as far as number of rivals and scope of rivalry, there are some big players in the oil and gas industry, but the rivalry between them isn't necessarily competitive in that they're marketing against each other. It's more so that since there's such little product differentiation between between gas station and gas station that that these companies basically just have to come down to price. And because OPEC essentially decides the price of oil and gas, it makes it a little hard to cut corners and drive that price down. That's why firms are given the recommendation to try and invest more in technology so they can drive that price down in any way that they can. And that includes utilizing automation in the refining process if need be. It also cuts down in human error as well, which will help the environmental crisis as well. So one tool we have to analyze the oil and gas industry is the 5 forces analysis. Again, this is a color-coded graph. Green means weak, red means strong, and blue in this case means moderate. There are 5 common factors that are analyzed here. There's the threat of new entrants, the bargaining power of suppliers, the threat of substitute products, and the bargaining power of buyers, and then the rivalry between them. I already talked a little bit about rivalry. There's not a huge push to campaign against other companies. So that one's just the moderate. Threat of new entrants is extremely weak because there are very high barriers to entry in the oil and gas industry. Some mom and pop shop can't just decide that they're going to open up a gas station. They have to be backed by the government. There are high starting costs, patents from other firms. And then even if they get into the industry, small new firms may have trouble counteracting and remaining competitive against all the regulations and high operating costs. The industry, although doesn't require much specializations, but there are certain aspects of it or positions that can be held that do, such as a welder or mechanic. Someone's hands-on would need previous experience and knowledge to perform job duties, whereas someone like an oil truck driver can go without it. So there are portions of being a new entrant that doesn't require much specialization or these high barriers to entry, but like I said, there's so many high startup costs to entering this specific industry that it is very difficult for new emerging companies to enter it. The bargaining power of suppliers, actually, excuse me, I'm going to go to the threat of substitute products first. There are no direct unique products to the industry. That's why this one was deemed weak. Other than the general threats of renewable energy, such as nuclear, hydrogen, solar, wind, and coal, the availability of these substitutes are rare as well, which makes it hard for consumers to find and replace in their lives. And normally the startup of these renewable energy options for personal use tend to be fairly expensive as well. So that one is deemed weak. Next is the bargaining power of buyers. In this industry, buyers are mainly concerned with 2 things. Like when you go to the gas station and you're looking for gas, most consumers are looking for the lowest price and for the highest quality, because most people like to take care of their cars. If you put low quality gas in your car, it's going to make it run weird and make it break down earlier. And then most people, when they're driving down the road, they just look for the cheapest gas they can find. Buyers have virtually no say in the price of the product because the product is largely undifferentiated and does not vary much from company to company. Buyers also do not have a lot of options to choose from in terms of gas because prices differ very little from company to company, so demand elasticity is low in this market. This means that buyers must rely on on quality when it comes to determining which company to purchase with. Again, since the product has no unique characteristics between competitors, the quality to be determined must be quality of service. For example, if a person were to try and find a gas station to fill up their car, there would be little to no difference in the gas itself between stations, and because of this, the price remains virtually the same or comparable among providers. This person would then find other means to determine which station to choose. These determinants can vary from anything from lighting to cleanliness to whether there is a convenience store at the station. This is the buyer choosing based on quality. On the larger scale of this industry, the buyers are refineries, national oil companies, traders, and governments themselves. Because the buyer has virtually no buying power to manipulate prices or quality, this force is deemed low. The next force we're going to go to is the bargaining power of suppliers. Suppliers in this industry, which could either mean other oil companies supplying to each other, or just the resources available to them in terms of suppliers. Essentially, the supply drives the price. So if there's a low supply in oil, then the price is going to be higher. If there's a high supply in oil, the price is going to be lower. That's just economics 101. So some of the top suppliers are Chevron, Shell, and ExxonMobil. And then, like it was said earlier, OPEC nations manipulate a significant amount over other nations and companies, which also gives them great power over others. That's why this one was the only force that was deemed strong, because this is really the only force that has such power over companies in the industry. And then like it said earlier about rivalry, really for that section, you only have to consider the upstream portion of the industry process. That, again, is the refining the exploration and production of oil. And like I said earlier, there's not a huge rivalry between them. Essentially, none of them have much jurisdiction over price, but like it was said, quality is huge to drive that sort of rivalry, because people care where they're getting their gas from. So that's essentially the 5 forces analysis. And then the next analysis for the oil and gas industry is the driving forces analysis. So I chose 4 driving forces that change impact in the oil and gas industry. And there was a little bit of confusion over where I got this graph from, but that one is one that I made. So the 4 driving forces that I chose were technological, cost and efficiency, regulations and policy, and societal norms, because these 4 at this point in the analysis were the 4 that had come up a lot. There are many other driving forces that could have been chosen, but these 4 seem the most dominant to me at this point in the analysis. Out of these 4, I found that cost and efficiency tended to be the leading driver, and this was because, I'm going to ignore in this, in the cost and efficiency section, the technological shifts, because some of those can be attributed to technological changes. But as discovered earlier in the 5 forces analysis, suppliers have extreme power over firms in the industry. So, again, since they have no real power over costs, then that would be a driving force a driving force of the industry. Next, technological. That one was deemed strong as well, but a little bit less than cost and efficiency, simply because, as mentioned earlier, any company that really comes up with that technological breakthrough or stays up to date with technology is essentially lowering costs through automation and remaining relevant in the industry, especially to consumers that are more concerned when it comes to the environment and renewable energy. Regulations and policy are the third driving force, and that one is about moderate. It's a little bit more than half of the cost and efficiency bar, and that is simply because the cost and efficient or the regulations and policy tend to drive the company in terms of their strategy and scope. Again, if this company is not following their regulations and policy, they will be hit with many many fines and lawsuits, possible deaths, which will drive down the company image and will raise costs for both the company and the consumer. And then the last driving force is societal norms. This one was deemed weak out of the four. Not completely weak out of all of them, but weak out of all possible driving forces, but weak out of these four, just because societal norms will drive companies in how they market towards their consumers, but will not necessarily drive companies to necessarily completely change up their processes. The last section of the external analysis is the competition analysis. And the four competitors that I chose were Shell, Exxon, Chevron, and Valero. And I didn't want to choose BP as part of this analysis simply because we talk about BP later in the internal analysis. And so I didn't want to be redundant with that. But I did include BP's circle in all three of these maps. So throughout this analysis, it kept coming up that Valero was a bit of an outlier. The first map, or the first graph is the strategic group mapping of price/perceived quality by geographic coverage, and then the diameter of the circle is market share, and the price inside the circle is, I believe that's revenues of the company at the time of this analysis. Anyway, so the first graph, price perceived quality versus geographic coverage, this is essentially shows that Chevron has the highest price/perceived quality, and they are also they are the lowest in geographic coverage, though, with the exception of Valero, which I already mentioned was an outlier in almost all of these graphs. Next was ExxonMobil. That one has about a middle of the range price and perceived quality. They're a little bit more globalized than Chevron. BP is about just as globalized as Exxon is, but they have a little bit lower price and perceived quality that most likely could be attributed to the some of the recent disasters they've had. And then Shell has the lowest price and perceived quality, but the highest globalization. They're nearly 80% globalized. The next strategic group mapping is companies mapped on vertical integration versus their number of investors. So So Valero has the lowest amount of vertical integration. They mainly just focus on upstream processes. They do not work in the downstream processes nearly at all, which is surprising. Other than Valero, Chevron has the next lowest upstream processes, but they are more downstream than anything. They are the most centralized out of all the companies in this analysis, though. The next one to be looked at is ExxonMobil. That one, they have the highest number of investors, and they work more in the downstream processes than Valero and Chevron as well. BP, they are the most in the downstream processes out of these 5 companies, and they have about 1,500 investors, so it's not too bad. And after that is Shell, and they work in the downstream process as well, but they're a little bit less. They're a little bit more towards upstream than BP is. And then the last strategic group mapping is stock recommendation by product line breadth. So the stock recommendation was found from an analysis on Thomson One. And most of the information on the financials and specific numbers like this were found on Thomson One. But for Chevron, they only have 3 main products. I believe theirs were, excuse me. Yeah, they only had 3 main products, and their analyst rating on whether to buy or sell their stock was more on the buy side than any other company in this analysis. Valero, on the other hand, has about 7 products, so they have the most available products to consumers, and they're also on the strong buy side of stocks as well. The rest of the companies all have 5 main product lines, those 3 being Shell, BP, and ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil, the analyst recommendation is to sell. BP is basically split in the middle between buy and sell. And then Shell is a little bit closer to the buy side. So some recommendations in the external analysis is, and all of this has been said before as well, but every relevant company in any market that has remained relevant without making anything exceptionally new in the market has had a huge technological breakthrough at some point prior. Companies in the oil and gas sector are expected to follow suit, and whichever firm in the industry makes that breakthrough is likely to remain relevant for a longer time after. Therefore, first, firms are recommended to put time and resources into the development and research of this technology. If firms do not, they risk losing that edge to a rival and becoming irrelevant. Second, regulations are the backbone of the industry. If regulations and policies are not closely followed, then there is a risk of safety hazards and penalties. These both are detrimental to companies and both paint them in a bad light and increase costs, which leads into the third and final industry recommendation, which is to reduce costs and efficiency as much as possible. This allows for economies of scale and higher profits in the long run. So that concludes the external analysis, and then next is the internal analysis, which is a look at BP itself. The first tool we have to look at the internal analysis is the 7S framework of BP. This is basically a diagram of 7 facets of the organizational analysis and is used to track the internal situation of a company. For the framework to be accurately utilized, each one of these 6 outlying factors must be balanced and equidistant from the shared values. From that explanation, you can see that strategy and staff are not as balanced as skill, structure, style, and systems. This is because ever since BP changed their strategy after the Deepwater Horizon spill to be one more of a cleaner one, they have not stuck to it. This is likely attributed to the fact that top management has not believed in this change. And if your top management doesn't believe in the change, doesn't believe in the company's own strategy, then the company is not going to flourish. The rest of them are pretty standard. Safety, which in this analysis was attributed to part of style, because safety is one of their core values. That one's really important to their core values, so that one's pretty balanced. Staff was low because, like I said, the staff themselves did not believe in the change in the company. System, structure, and skills were all well balanced. Those ones are all pretty self-explanatory. The next diagram, and this one is part of the organizational culture, which, like I said, is style, is the 4 dimensions of organizational culture matrix, and then also included in this is the summary of the 7S framework. But this matrix that you see here is the 4 dimensions of organizational culture. There are 4 intersecting lines. There's independence, stability, interdependence, and flexibility. And then off of that are the different types of leadership you can have. The black dot that I have on my screen is, or on this matrix, is where I believe their lower tier management to be. So essentially the people that are out on the rigs doing the work. Those people are closer to the safety sort of area in this matrix, but are a little bit more interdependent. And then as you move to top tier management, which is this gray circle, top tier management tends to lean more towards results and stability than safety, which I feel is where a lot of the cutting corners and safety concerns have been with the company. To summarize, BP may talk a big game when it comes to safety and security, but when the general public thinks of BP, the first thing they probably think of is the Deepwater Horizon disaster. After even that disaster, BP has had a laundry list of other concerns. For example, they have an awful workplace safety record, including an explosion in 2005 of a refinery in Texas City, which OSHA determined to be the fault of the company's cost-cutting schemes. BP has also suffered lawsuits against human rights, and aside from these, BP has also faced changes for anti-competitive practices and royalty disputes. They may say that they're for safety. In fact, they push the idea on their website, but in practice it seems otherwise. BP's top management needs to really decide what's important, cost-cutting or the safety of their employees. A quick analysis of their resources. They have quite a few tangible assets. They have 3 U.S. refineries, 5 European refineries, 3 global refineries, 2 U.S. petrochemical plants, and 4 European petrochemical plants. And in 2015, they cashed $126 billion in fixed assets. And then part of these, and in the intangible resources, they had some brand damage after the Deepwater Horizon disaster, but they had worked on rebuilding it. They changed their slogan from just British Petroleum to Beyond Petroleum, to sort of get the idea that they weren't just an oil and gas company and that they would be striving to work for the betterment of the environment as well. But that, like I said, has not remained true. And as said earlier, their top management does not have any belief in change. One of the tools we have to assess the capabilities of a company is the VRIO framework analysis of BP. This is a two-part sort of diagram here. On the right, we have the actual framework, and on the left, I have a table of my my assumptions of the company. So you can see from here that most of the most of these resources are in the temporary competitive advantage, with one being logistics competitiveness in the unused competitive advantage, and then only 2 of these resources are being fully utilized, and that's their market position and their brand awareness. Essentially, if they're not in that lower orange circle of sustained competitive advantage, then they have a lot of work to do on it, the further away from it they are. So, strategy alignment, project portfolio, financial resources, customer loyalty, pricing strategy, and brand positioning all have a lot of work to be done before they can be considered sustained competitive advantage. Some of their capabilities continued is a human capital mapping matrix of BP. In this matrix, you can see there are 4 main sectors that the employees of a company can reside in. There's complementary, strategic, support, and core. Core tends to be high value, low diversity. Strategic is high value, high diversity. Low value, high diversity is complementary, and low value, low diversity is support. Through this research, I found that lower tier companies have been more in the, lower tier management, has been more in the core side. And this means that that means that they're focused on productivity and are hired based on current skill level. Their training and development are job specific, and they get paid the market rate. They focus on performance and make above average mistakes. These employees are also transactional and internalized, and the employees, like I said, are high value, low diversity. This is where BP was placed in its analysis because its employees are hired based on skill and their training is job specific. As employees are moved up the chain of command in a higher tier management, there's a shift to be more support based, where the employees tend to do the job routinely and have a narrow scope. These support type employees are those that have a focus on compliance. These employees tend to be outsourced and simplified. They are also very procedure based and follow what they are told with a narrow scope. These employees are not encouraged to make mistakes and are given an hourly pay. On the matrix, these employers are low in diversity and low in value and are more transactional and external. So that's about where their lower tier management versus their higher tier management is placed on the human capital mapping matrix. A quick financial analysis in order to really determine how a company is doing. You look at these 3 numbers here, and that's return on assets, return on equity, and return on invested capital. And compared in this table here against their top competitors, BP is doing the worst in return on assets. They're doing the worst on return on equity, and they're doing the worst on return on capital. So out of all of their competitors, their financials are not very strong at all. And then summary of financial analysis, like I said, they fail in a lot of those tests and honestly should do a complete management overhaul if they want to experience competitive growth rates in the future. The other assessments, financial profitability and valuation, they're doing well. And then all of this financial information was found from NASDAQ. So a quick and SWOT analysis of BP. Again, SWOT is internal strengths, internal weaknesses, external opportunities, and external threats. Some strengths to BP is the number of branches and therefore projects that they have. They have a high brand loyalty. They got their new slogan, which is starting to spur customers to be more hopeful that they'll be more environmentally friendly. Their whole brand rebuilding, they've got pretty solid leadership, even though this leadership is still intent on cutting corners. And they have a high network of other companies and economies that will help them in times of need. Some internal weaknesses are the many environmental disasters they have caused. And because of these disasters, they've incurred fines, poor management decisions. They're trying to break into the clean energy market, but they are struggling at it and therefore have had layoffs. Some external opportunities are the research and development opportunities of this new clean energy market, some new explorations even in the oil and gas market, and some new partnerships that they've made, and some really great infrastructure that they have started investing in. And then some external threats, weak social responsibility causing disasters, penalties and lawsuits that come with this, which has also sparked competition from firms doing better than them. Next is the threat of losing customers to companies more focused and driven than them, and their poor brand reputation currently and how it can stunt future growth. And then lastly is the economic threat BP faces in terms of oil prices and the push for alternative fuel. And then the last section of this analysis is the value chain analysis. There's two sectors to this. There is this top portion in blue, which is the secondary activities, and then the one in green is primary activities. Secondary activities include firm infrastructure, human resource management, development of technology, and procurement. And then when you're looking at the primary activities, it goes in this order, specifically from upstream to downstream. It goes from extraction, which is the gathering of raw materials, to logistics, which is bringing those raw materials to the plant, which is refining, which is the third, portion of this chain, which is the refining of these materials into a usable product. And then the logistics from getting that product to the store where it will be sold. The next chain is marketing, which is to boost the sales of that product. And then the last chain is maintenance, which is proactive servicing of machinery. And this is where I feel that BP really fails, is in that maintenance and staying proactive on top of their processes and making sure that everything is safe and regulated. And then at the end, the value added to the company minus the cost is the profit margin. And then the last thing is the external and internal recommendations. Externally, there are certain qualities needed by companies to be successful in the industry and become a major player. In this industry, the oil and gas industry, it was concluded that companies should complete 3 tasks to become and remain relevant in the market. First, look for renewable resource opportunities. Second, follow government regulations. And third, invest in new technology. The 5 forces analysis showed us that all forces to the industry were weak except for the bargaining power of suppliers and rivalry between firms, which were strong and moderate, respectively. With all this in consideration, firms are recommended to spend time and resources into research and development of new technology. Becoming the first company in the industry to make the technological breakthrough will give the company a major edge over other competitors and remain relevant. Companies in the industry are also strongly urged to remain close to government regulations and to not cut corners. The public is very wary of oil and gas companies further polluting the earth and will be quick to cast out companies that do damage. And then internally, throughout the course of this analysis, one consistent has come up with as an issue with BP, their top management. BP's management, ever since the 2010 Deepwater Horizon scandal, has failed to become what they promised, a cleaner, more reliable company. There have since been more lawsuits, more spills, more deaths, and more cut corners. The young people of today have their eyes on the earth, and many are extremely concerned for the environment and will not stand for a company that does not take care of it, such as BP. If BP wants to become relevant again and get back the brand image they so desire, then they must step up and stick to their slogan and mission, Beyond Petroleum, or else they run the risk of becoming completely and irreversibly irrelevant and becoming bankrupt. To do so, BP is recommended to invest in younger, more environmentally conscious management who will still steer BP in the right direction and broaden the scope of their processes. Thank you.